what I want to talk to you guys this evening about is queen rearing. And this is going to be like a complete intro, where to start if you know nothing about queen rearing. We're going to talk about the differences between a queen rearer and a queen breeder, how to get started on your own, different methods of queen rearing, equipment, some of the recommendations and stuff based on my experience as a queen breeder here in central West Virginia. And I'm at a pretty high altitude. I'm about 2,400 feet. So I'm in a colder area, a colder climate of West Virginia. We've had probably the last month and a half right here, it's been in the low 20s or lower, and no bee flight at all for like a month and a half. And then today it gets up to like 58, and the bees were out flying today. I did get to look through some of them, and they're looking pretty good so far. So as she mentioned, I am Jason Bragg. I own and operate New River Honeybees. And at the bottom left of this slide, you'll see my website, www.newriverhoneybees.com, and my email address. That's my personal email address. Feel free to send me an email or ask questions, whatever you need to do. Also, I have a YouTube channel, which I'm not going to put up a link for that, but you could just search for it if you wanted to find it. I have a Facebook page for New River Honeybees, and I also have a Patreon page. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the first couple slides. Oh, the other thing I was going to mention, I just remembered, if you can't find the raise your hand feature at the end, whenever you get ready to start asking questions, you have to click on the participants button at the bottom, and it opens a list of people that are in this presentation. And on there, you should have a raise hand button. So first thing you need to ask yourself about queen breeding or queen rearing is which you want to be. And there is a difference. A lot of people don't think about it, but a queen rearer is a person who makes queens, but doesn't necessarily get involved in the process of evaluating them, the record keeping, the selective breeding, improvement of stock, and all the really time consuming stuff. A queen rearer is someone that typically buys breeder queens from someone else or gets a really good stock or genetics that they like, and they raise queens from that. The queen breeder is a person who also makes queens, but spends a lot of time evaluating their stock, record keeping, selective breeding. They have goals of improving the stock and breeding specific traits into their stock. Like I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Brother Adam from Buckfast Abbey. He was probably one of the most popular, well-known breeders of the past century. With his Buckfast honeybees, and he was a breeder. He went all over the world and collected different species of honeybees to breed together to try to find races and traits that worked well with each other to get a honeybee that worked well in his area. So typically breeders are the folks that breed the queens and make the breeder queens that are sold to queen rearers to help spread the genetics. Sometimes queen breeders will sell limited amounts of stock out to the public. I do myself, but it's quicker for me to get the good genetics out in the world by selling breeder queens to people that make a lot more queens than I do, than it is for me to actually try to, sell to the entire public. So and many of you know this because lots of you have tried to buy queens off of me. I sell out really quick. I have a short season here, and I can only make so many queens. Usually I cap it at about 2,000 a year or a summer. And then I'm starting to get lots of breeders out there and people that want to work with me to take those genetics that I've worked so hard to produce and make queens and sell from those genetics. So it's doubling the effort or tripling the effort for every breeder that gets out there to the amount of those genetics that get out in the US. So both the queen rearer and queen breeder need to start out in the same place. So in order to successfully make queens, there's some things you have to know. And you can see a couple pictures here. On the right is a queen cell frame, all packed up with royal jelly and capped off. On the left is a batch of virgin queens. And I think that was from last year. The picture from the left was last year. Maybe the one on the right was even earlier year. So there are many ways or methods of making queens. And making queens always means making increases, because you have to have support bees for all the queens, all the nukes, everything that you're doing. So to talk about some of these methods, I've kind of put together this little table to help give you an idea of the method, the difficulty, and the number of queens that you might be able to produce with that method. So the easiest method, of course, is a walk-away split, but you're not going to get a lot of queens out of that. That's depending on how many colonies or nukes you already have. And you're probably only going to get another queen per nuke or per colony every 30 days or so. So that's not a real efficient way of being a queen breeder or a queen rearer. That's a good way of making increases, though. Cutting swarm cells, easy. Does require wax foundation, because it's really hard to cut a swarm cell off of a plastic foundation. The number of queens you can make varies, but it's slow also. Cutting emergency cells, and also requires wax foundation, but it's also slow. It's the alley method. It's easy. It also requires wax foundation, and you can probably make a little higher number of queen cells and virgin queens using the alley method than you can the walk away and the cutting cells and all that. Notching, it's moderate. You can make a fair number of queen cells that way, but it's still not real efficient. The on the spot, or Mel Disselton, I never can pronounce his name right, is moderate, and it's a pretty good method. Cell punch method, you're starting to get up into higher numbers of queen production. And I'm going to talk about each of these methods in a little more detail as we move along. The Nicot system, it's getting up there with creating more queens. It's more moderate to the number of queens you can produce in a short amount of time. Of course, the grafting or Doolittle method is a little bit more advanced method. It takes some more practice, but that is the fastest, most efficient way of making queens. So, and we'll talk about those as we move on. So deciding on which method depends on your goals. How good's your vision? Because that's going to affect some of the ways that you do this. How good's your fine motor skills? Mine are getting worse and worse every year. Is it just you making queens, or do you have help? Because if you start making a lot of queens, it gets very labor intensive. How many queens do you want to make per week, per month, per season? And how good are you at planning or setting schedules and sticking strictly to them? Because queen rearing or queen breeding is all about sticking strictly to that schedule. If you miss one day, you could lose a whole batch of queens. And depending on how many you're making at a time, that could be 500, it could be 50, it could be 10,000, depending on how big your operation is. So for the grafting or Doolittle method, you're actually manually pulling out day-old larvae from the brood comb, from the frames, and placing them into a plastic or wax queen cell cup. And some people make their own out of beeswax. Some people like plastic. I use the plastic JZBZ cups. They're the fastest for me. They work great. Tried the Chinese versions, and I think there's some kind of something in the plastic that off gases, and I don't get nearly as many takes, even though they're almost identical to the brand name JZBZ cups. They don't have as many takes for me. So I like the brand name JZBZ cups. When I'm grafting, if you look at the picture on the left, you can see larvae down in those cells. I go for the number one or the number two at worst case scenario, but I would rather go for the number one larva. You can just barely see it. Sometimes you can't see it at all. I've learned over the years that if I see a puddle of jelly in the bottom of that cell, I just go for it anyway. And when I pull back my grafting tool, I can see it on the tip of the tool. Sometimes I can't even see that larva when I'm grafting it. And you get quicker at that as you go. If I'm working with a queen that's failing and I don't have a lot of larvae to choose from, I will make them from a number 2 sized larva there, but I don't like to. You don't get as good a queens in the end. Sometimes they don't live as long or produce quite as well. They're not a whole lot of difference, but I can see a difference where I'm dealing with so many queens. So how good is your vision? How good is your fine motor skills? So you better be able to see pretty good or have a magnifying glass and not be very shaky to do this method. Now, there are people that have come up with all methods of stabilization and magnifying glasses and flashlights. And if you're going to use a flashlight, make sure you use an LED flashlight because you don't want the heat of an old style bulb going into that cell and cooking your larva. So when you're creating or making your queens or choosing your cells, your eggs, larvae, I get the word right here in a minute. Your breeder lays the egg on day 1. Those eggs hatch or they turn into larvae on day 3. And your goal is to graft or cell punch or whatever method you're using on day 4. Of course, day 8, the cells are sealed and you can, put them out at that point. You can put them into a finisher and the mating nukes. There's a real short time frame in there around day 8 that you don't want to shake them very much. Now, if you read other things online, they'll say don't touch them at all during that time. When you're dealing with as many as I do, sometimes with the timing, you have to move them during those sensitive time periods. I don't move them at all unless they're capped, and that's when I'm using a queenless cell builder. Now, if I'm using a starter finisher, that's 2 different colonies and it's a whole different ball game. What I'm talking about with this particular slide is a queenless cell builder. So the larvae are actually put into the cell bars, the frames, and they're put into a queenless colony and they're left in there until time to move out to a mating nuke or into an incubator. If you have to move them during the sensitive days around 6, 7, 8, somewhere in that area, 9, actually anything after 9 to 13, all of that's kind of sensitive. Just be really careful and don't shake them around a lot, and they should be fine. A lot of times I'll move them out on day 8 or 9 and put them in an incubator, and I'll finish them out in an incubator. I'll let them hatch in an incubator, or emerge would be the proper word. And then I'll put the virgins out into nukes, or I'll bank them for use in artificial insemination, because when you're making breeder queens, you have to age them like 7 days before you can inseminate them. So those virgins have to be banked for 7 days and then inseminated. So then at the end of that whole run, around 27, 28 days, almost a month, you should have mated queens back in those nukes. That's why I say using the walk-away split method is one of the slowest methods, because you're taking one frame and moving it over, or 2 or a half a box and moving it over, and you're making a split out of it, and you won't get a mated queen in there until probably a month later. And if you're lucky, sometimes they don't get a mated queen back, or sometimes she gets killed on her mating flight. Lots of things can happen. So the planning, sticking strictly to it, again, is very important. There's better information. There's a online Excel document, and maybe I'll try to get you guys a link for that later. I believe it's on one of the Ohio beekeeping sites where it's a queen breeding or queen production calculator. You just plug in the date that you're grafting, and it automatically fills in all the other dates for you. It works pretty slick. I use it all the time. So what's the first thing you need? First thing you need, obviously, is bees. So the more colonies you have to start out with, the better. If I had to give you a minimum, I would say at least 10 colonies to start making queens. You can make them with less, obviously, but you can't make large numbers with less. For example, if you had one colony, you can do a walk-away split, and then you have made a queen. So that's 2 queens, but you're not going to get very far very fast that way. If you're doing any number of production of queens, you're going to need at least 10 colonies to move stuff around to get started with. Always try to start with the best stock you can, preferably something that has already lived through a winter in your area. I use winters here as the winters here are part of my selection process. I don't feed them up extremely heavy to try to put them through a winter here. I have lots of nukes that I try to overwinter here, and if a nuke can overwinter here, it's a pretty hardy stock. Say, where do you get the best stock to start with? Well, chances are you already have a good line of stock to start out with. If you've had bees more than one winter and they're producing honey and you're happy with their traits, they're friendly, they're not super aggressive, and they're doing everything you want them to do, and they're surviving where you're at, then they're already survivors in your climate, and probably 95% better than any package bees that you can, or package queens you could purchase. The area, climates, location is very important when it comes to queen breeding and queen rearing, because it doesn't take a very big span of miles or climates to change everything in the way a bee behaves. I can have a whole yard of a certain race of bees or line of bees here, and I can take them 10 miles down the road and they behave differently, and they react differently. They have different things they forage from. So it doesn't take very much of a distance to make a whole lot of difference in how your bees react. So, and you never know also where you're sending them. I've got bees here, and I've ran colonies here for several years now that not all of them are, because the different lines have different traits, and I try to keep them true to those traits. But I've got lines here that I've ran treatment free for 3 or 4 years now, and no problems. They make honey, they do great, they're never sick. I can send those bees to 15 other places, and maybe 3/4 of those places they'll do just as well as they do here, and the other 25%, or the other 25%, they might bomb. They may completely crash because there's a commercial beekeeper nearby, or somebody that's got 400 hives that has mite bombs and they don't treat, or they're not very mite resistant. There's just so many variables. So if your current stock, though, doesn't suit your goals, then the next option would be to either buy an artificially inseminated breeder queen or 2, or find somebody's stock that in your area that you know is doing really well, so that you can start with good genetics or good traits and then build up on your own. So what about starting with package bees? I'm not entirely against that. If you don't have any other options, you can start with package bees. I would not, in my area, and it's different in different areas. In my area, if I started with packages, I would leave those package queens in there just long enough for them to get brood, and then I would requeen them with some local stock or some better stock that is more used to or prepared to handle your climate and your winters. Most package queens are produced in mass in southern states, and when I see them come up here, they crash really quickly, or they'll build up really fast and make monster hives until maybe October or November, and then suddenly the hive's completely empty and all the honey and everything's left. There's not even any dead bees in the colony. And I have my own theories as to why that is. But you're always better going with a genetic or a line of bees that is known to do well in your area or has been bred for climates similar to yours. And I never start with packages late in the season. If you're going to start with packages, always do it early, as early as you can, that weather will permit. Get that queen switched out and then get them built up with that new queen. It takes about 40 days for all of those package bees to die off, and then that colony's running on the new queen's genetics. If you're starting from scratch, if you can get nukes, go for nukes. Nukes are always the best bet to start out with. And if you can get local nukes, that's even better. What kind of equipment? You're going to need lots of equipment for queen rearing or queen breeding. I keep 5-frame nuke boxes. I keep 8-frame, 10-frame boxes. And I keep mating nukes for getting the virgin queens that you make open mated. A lot of times I will overwinter in larger colonies, double deep 10 frames or bigger. And then I will break them all down in the spring to 5-frame or 4-frame nuke boxes. And I'll use those for breeding, evaluation, splits. They tend to build up quicker in a smaller box where they're more tightly compacted, and I guess they're able to heat it better. But they tend to always do better in a smaller box. They'll also swarm on you quicker in a smaller box, but you got to keep an eye on them. But I like to get them in small boxes to do lots of queen work and nukes and whatever I'm doing throughout the summer. And then I'll combine those all in the fall into large boxes and feed them a little bit and then overwinter them. I do have a handful. When I say handful, I'm talking 100 or so nukes that I'll take into winter, just testing certain lines, new stuff that I'm working on. So the walkaway split, this is going back to our table where we talked about the time frames and the different types of queen rearing. Probably the simplest method of a walkaway split is if you've got a double deep colony, 10-frame, 8-frame, 5-frame, whatever it may be. If it's double deep, take the top box off. After they've got brood in both boxes, of course, the queen's laid in both boxes. Take the top box off, set it over to the side on a new bottom board with a new cover, and whichever box that doesn't have the queen will realize they're queenless, and if they've got eggs and larvae, they will make a new queen, and in 30 days or so, she should be mated and laying in that new box. That's the simplest method of making an increase. There's always a chance that that new box, whichever one didn't have the queen, there's always a chance it won't make a new queen. They'll try if they've got eggs and larvae, but sometimes they'll make 2 or 3 virgin queens and they'll all kill each other before they get to fly out and mate. Sometimes they'll fly out and a dragonfly will catch them. Lots of things can happen to keep them from getting a mated queen back. So if you do walk away splits, you got to keep an eye on them and make sure that they're not going queenless for too long. If you don't see a queen come back and start laying pretty soon, then you need to give them another queen or another frame of eggs or something to help them get another one going. So the pros and cons of the walkaway split is, it's done with a fair amount of brood. It's essentially made, it's an increase. You make a new hive that way, whether it be a nuke or a 10-frame box. One of the cons, it's slow. You can't make a lot of queens that fast with this method. You need to make these sort of splits to start with, though, to help increase your colonies if you don't have a lot. Get your numbers up to a sustainable number. And if you're planning on becoming a queen breeder and you're actually going to put in the time of evaluating each colony, testing for all the different traits or qualities you like, and selectively breeding out the ones, crossing the ones that you like best, you're going to need probably 100 colonies to be able to successfully do that and see fairly decent time frames on your improvements. Another pro to that method of the walkaway split, it doesn't require a separate mating nuke box. You've just made a split, and they're going to make a new queen in that split. Like I said earlier, it's going to take like a month for that queen to get back, so it's not a real fast method. Okay, so cutting swarm cells, cutting emergency cells. There's two methods that require using wax foundation, because I have cut them off a plastic foundation, but it's not easy. You got to be really careful. Cutting swarm cells requires that you crowd your bees. When they're ready to swarm, they're going to make a bunch of swarm cells, and you go in with a sharp knife, razor knife or something, cut out the cells. Once they're capped, then you can place them into queenless mating nukes or splits, whatever you want to put them in, and they'll emerge in there, fly out, and get mated. Cutting emergency cells, same method, except for instead of crowding the colony to the point where they're ready to swarm and they make cells, you're actually caging the queen or removing the queen and making them think they're queenless. And once they think they're queenless, they're going to start building emergency cells. And once they're capped, you cut them out the same way. And there is a 4-mile-long debate on what's the best type of queen cell. Some people say, oh, I like emergency cells. Some people say, I like swarm cells. I'm not going to get into that debate. That's a whole nother lecture on its own. So the alley method, this is a pretty interesting method. I've played with it some. Basically, you're taking a frame of foundationless or wax foundation with no wires in it, and you're finding a strip in that frame where the queen has laid and the larvae are about the right age for grafting and making queen cells, and you're cutting that strip out about 1 inch wide. Some people will turn it upside down. They'll make their colony that they're going to raise their queens in queenless. They'll turn that piece upside down so that the larva is hanging down just like a queen cell would, and they'll place it between the gap between two frames at the top of the frames, and then the bees will go up and they'll pick the ones they want, and they'll draw down queen cells off of those. Other people will take that strip and they'll stick it to the bottom of a piece of comb like they've done in this picture to the right, and the bees will recognize those and pick out the ones they like the best, and they'll make queens out of those. So it's a pretty neat method. It works pretty well. It's not extremely fast. You can't make a ton of cells and queens that way, but it works. The Miller method is a variation of that. Basically, they just cut edges on the cells, and wherever the edges are, the bees want to make queen cells, and they'll typically, you could do this with a swarm cell type situation where you've pack the bees in so tight they're ready to swarm, or you could do it by removing a queen and letting them draw out their own queen cells on the edges. I've kind of already talked about some of the pros and cons to these methods. They do require a separate mating nuke, so that's more equipment. You don't need to learn to graft with this method. You do need to be able to determine the correct age larva. Doesn't require any specialized or expensive equipment, and you can make a variable number of queen cells. The stronger the colony, the more they'll make. Can't use plastic foundation. A lot of big operations like plastic foundation because they can shake bees off it. They can do what they need to do and don't have to worry about blowing the frame out. So notching, or Mel Disselkin's method, on the spot method. These are very similar methods, maybe even the same depending on how you look at it. But basically, you're taking a frame like the picture below, and you're finding an area of larva on that frame that is the proper age for grafting or raising queens. And you basically take your hive tool and sink it in at the bottom of that cell. You can see the line of cells. I don't know if you guys can see my mouse or not, but you can see the line of cells where he's mashed a lot of the cells, but it's barely cut the bottom out of that top row. And those worker bees or nurse bees will go up and they'll check those larvae out, and they'll draw queen cells off of those, and they'll pull them out and down. So pros and cons to that. You don't need to learn to graft with that method. You do need to be able to determine the correct larva age. It requires separate mating nukes, so you do have to have some more equipment. It doesn't require specialized or expensive equipment, just more boxes, more bees. You can make a decent number of queens this way, but not a large number. Again, the number is going to be very similar to the previous method that we talked about, the alley method. And I said on here in the cons that you can't use plastic foundation with this, but technically you could. This depends on how much you want to do and how careful you are with it. Cell punch method. With this method, you're getting up there into method that's capable of making a higher number of queens. Still not as high as grafting, but it's still a pretty useful method. I know a lot of people that use this method, and it works really well. You're not actually having to touch the larva this way. Basically, they have these little, it's a ring like you would use in a compression fitting for a gas line. Like if you were running a copper gas line, those type rings, you get the right size ring and they weld it onto a little handle, and they keep it in a crock pot or something that keeps the water warm, and it keeps that whole piece of metal and that piece of brass warm. And they find the cell that they want to use for making a queen from, the proper age larva, and then you pull that little tool out of the hot water, and it just melts right across the wax, and you can push that plug right out, and it doesn't even go within the cell. It cuts out around the outside of that particular cell. Then you can take that plug and attach it to a queen cell frame or cell bars, put it into a starter, finisher, however you want to make your queens, whether it's a queenless starter or a starter finisher system, and they'll draw them out. And they make really nice cells this way too. It takes a little longer to sit there and punch each one out. It does damage your comb a little bit, but it doesn't take them but a day. If it's a strong colony, in a day or two, they'll build that comb back in. Does not work with plastic foundation. But it's a pretty nice method. It will work with wire foundation so long as you're not picking cells over top of a wire, otherwise you could, of course, push through the wire. So pros and cons: you also don't need to learn how to graft with this method. Cell punch tool is easy to make, very durable. It can be as productive as grafting, but takes a lot longer. Like if you're going to graft 100 larvae to make 100 queen cells, I can do that in less than 15 minutes and be done. I mean, I can have the frame out, grafted, back in, and everything where it needs to be in 15 minutes if it's just 100 that I'm making. And with the cell punch method, it might take you an hour or maybe an hour and a half to do that same number. It requires separate mating nukes, just like grafting would, to get those queens mated. And lots of queen cells can be made this way, but again, it takes longer, and you can't use plastic foundation. So Nicot system, a lot of people have seen this advertised. It requires that you make a specialized frame that has its own little plastic box or containment area for the queen, and it has its own little plastic cell cups. So basically you trap the queen, you put her in that little box, she runs around in there and she lays in each of those cell cups. Then you pull them out and you put them into the cell bars and put them into your cell starter. This method is not one of my favorite methods. You can make a lot of queens this way, but the equipment, it's specialized equipment, and it's pretty expensive if you're doing a lot of it. But the big kicker for me is I've never gotten a queen to just go in there and start laying. I've had to put them, when I've tested this method 4 or 5 years ago, I would put the queen in, and it might take her 3 or 4 days to decide she likes that area well enough to start laying in there. Eventually they do, and it works, but it's not one of my favorite methods. Pros and cons to that method: you don't need to learn to graft, of course. You don't need to guess at the proper age of larva, because you know what day you put her in there, you know what day she starts laying on, so it's real easy to time the larva. It can be as productive as grafting, but it takes longer sometimes because the queens are hesitant to lay in the plastic cups. It still requires separate mating nukes to get your queens mated and started laying. It requires a purchase of fairly expensive proprietary equipment, and it requires a lot of handling of the queen, which I don't particularly like because then it becomes much easier to accidentally kill your queen. And if she's $1,000 breeder queen, that's not a good thing. So the grafting method, the Doolittle method, and this is, in my opinion, if you're going to make a lot of queens, this is the quickest, best way to do it, and probably the least expensive method of doing it. Also, it doesn't matter what type of foundation you use. It's the most popular method of queen rearing for commercial queen breeders, queen rearers, for making lots of queens. It requires a manual removal of 24-hour-old larvae from the brood frames with a specialized grafting tool, and you can get them for pennies off of eBay from China, then placing the larva into queen cell cups. Now, this I would not go cheap on. I would get the JZBZ queen cell cups, or if you like the Nicot roller cage type stuff, you can graft directly into those without using that plastic square queen laying device that she's hesitant about starting laying in. You can, graft directly into your frames or your cell bars, put them into your queenless starter. I like a queenless starter myself. Some people do different methods, and we'll talk about the different methods of starters here in a little while. But this method works real well. I've found that with the Chinese grafting tools, which is what I like, the ones that you can buy for pennies, on eBay, if you take that grafting tool, I might have one laying here somewhere. Yeah, I have one right here. This is the Chinese grafting tool. Where's my camera? It's got a little flapper of a thing there, reed that it uses to pick up the larva, and then you got a plunger to push it off with. Okay, sometimes, well, most of the time, that little piece of reed will be really stiff when you get these new, and you can't graft out a new comb with it. If it's new comb or light colored comb, that reed is so stiff it'll just poke right through the center if it's not plastic foundation. So what I'll do with these is I'll pull them apart. They pull apart just like an ink pen, and I'll take a piece of 600 grit sandpaper, and I'll take a lot off of that piece of reed so it's really soft. And sometimes it'll even feather a little on the end. If it does, I just take a pair of fingernail clippers or something and smooth it back, round it back off. Then when you push it in, it hardly takes anything to bend that reed up and scoop it right under the larva. So these I really like. I've tried a lot of different things. I've tried even the real expensive ones. I don't know if I have it laying here anywhere. The automatic grafting tool, and I haven't quite got the hang of it yet. Here it is. It's the Pierce automatic grafting tool. It's an expensive grafting tool. Looks like this. Basically, you hold it between your fingers, and it's got a little plunger, a little tongue that comes out. Same deal. You push the tongue out, scoop the larva. When you put it into the cell cup, you let the plunger up, and it pushes the larva off. I still like the Chinese grafting tool better than this. I haven't quite got used to using that yet. So pros and cons to grafting. It's fast and efficient, makes lots of queen cells. It's the most widely accepted method among commercial queen breeders. It's the cheapest method for making hundreds or thousands of queen cells. And it's my preferred method, and that's what I use here at New River Honeybees. Cons, it requires separate mating nukes for each queen to get them mated, which a lot of the methods do, and it requires some specific equipment, but not as expensive as the Nicot system. Now, a lot of people I know will use the Nicot roller cages and the cell bars and everything, and just not use the square queen box, and that's fine too if you're not doing 500 of them at a time, it doesn't get too expensive that way. But if you're doing a bunch of them, that can get fairly expensive. So quick recap on comparing methods. Walkaway splits, cutting cells, alley method, notching. We've talked about lots of different methods there. All of those methods that we talked about in the beginning can take 30 days per queen to make, or roughly. It's not a real quick method. Cell punch methods, Nicot is a little quicker. You might be able to do good with 100 queens a month, that method. And if you want to be able to keep growing your option or your operation, obtain sustainability, produce higher numbers of queens per month, grafting, the Doolittle method, that's the best method. You can make anywhere from 1 to 1,000 queens a month or more, depending on the amount of colonies and the time you have and the helpers you have. It takes a lot of work when you start making a lot of queens. So cell punch, Nicot, grafting methods all require that you run a cell builder system of some sort. And like most things in beekeeping, there's lots of different ways to do it. Every beekeeper you ask will have a different method. I like the Queenless cell builder, which is an all-in-one system. Basically, I take a strong colony, shake lots of bees into it, make it really strong. I'll pull the queen out and I'll pop in, I'll make sure there's no queen cells in there that they've started. I'll pop in a cell bar with a bunch of grafts on it, and they will make better than 90% almost every time for me. That takes practice. When I first started, for the first couple of times, I only got maybe 50% takes. And then the more you do it, the better you get. The starter finisher method requires 2 different colonies. You have a starter colony that basically starts the cells, draws them out for 24, 48 hours, and then they're moved from that colony into a strong queen right finisher colony. And with, of course, the queen is separated away from the box where the cells are put in with a queen excluder, but it will build finisher cells, fill them up with royal jelly until they're ready to pull out and either put in an incubator or put into mating nukes. And then there's the cloak board method. Basically, that's a method where you've got a metal slide, a metal plate that slides between your upper and lower brood bodies of your colony to make the colony think for a temporary time that the top box is queenless, because you've slid a piece of metal between them. They can't pass that pheromone up, and they want to make queen cells in the top part. Then as soon as they start the queen cells, you pull that piece of metal back out, and they will then finish and draw them out. And so it's kind of a starter finisher built together. I personally still like the cell builder, the Queenless cell builder system. That's what I found works best for me, and that's what I've gotten more used to. So how do I build and maintain Queenless cell builders? I start with a regular 10 frame bottom board. On top of that goes 10 frame medium depth super filled with undrawn foundation. And this is going to sound a little odd because a lot of people don't do it this way, but there's a reason for this. And since I've started telling people about it, I see more people doing it now. The reason is because in that 10 medium that's filled with undrawn foundation, on top of that goes a queen excluder, and you're making your queen cells over top of that. A queenless cell builder tends to call in virgin queens that you didn't even know existed in the area. And if you've ever tried to make queen cells and you've had a virgin queen come into your cell starter, she will go up there and tear down every cell you've got. And if you've got that medium super underneath with a queen excluder in between, when she comes in, she can't get up to your cells. She'll make residence into that medium below. She'll start laying in there. They won't destroy it. They might destroy a few of them, but they won't destroy all of your cells upstairs. And then once you realize that you've got a virgin queen down there, you just take that medium off, set it off, give its own top and bottom board, and you've started another colony, and then you can go back to work with your queenless cell builder, and you haven't lost all your cells. So on top of that queen excluder is another 10 frame deep hive body, and I place that entire setup in the place or the spot where an already existing 10 frame single deep strong colony is setting, making sure to put their entrances in the same location. And then I move the existing colony that was setting there, the strong colony, to the side, and I turn the entrance in the opposite direction. And well, that's weird. Next, I find the queen cager, and then I move all the contents of the existing strong colony over to the cell starter that I've made the colony into that is now the new cell builder that is setting where the old strong colony was. If there's 8 frames of brood in there, I'll move it all over. If there's not, I will find brood from other colonies and add to it, because I want 8 frames of brood, at least 8 frames of brood in there to start with. Brood and bees. I shake the remaining bees from the old existing colony into the new cell builder, and use the caged queen to start a new nuke or requeen, or I'll put her somewhere else. When I'm finished building the cell builder, it'll have, aged bees from foraging to everything, and it'll be super strong. It's already, it was already a strong colony to start with. It'll have 8 frames of bees ready to emerge, and that means more nurse bees. That means more royal jelly or jelly, and the stronger the better. The more you've got in there, the younger, with feed and pollen, the better, prettier cells are going to build. If there isn't enough bees to suit me, I'll go find other frames, and I'll shake bees from other colonies in there, being careful though not to shake in the queen from another colony. I'll put sugar syrup feeder on top, because cell builders must be continuously fed for quality queens. And every time I put in a new starter, every time I put in a new frame of eggs, I will put in another pollen patty on top and another fill up of sugar syrup, 1-to-1 sugar syrup. And usually, if everything's working properly, by the time you check that frame to see how many of your cells are capped off, that entire pollen patty will be gone. They will have used it to make royal jelly to feed those queens that they're making. The resulting colony should stay continuously packed with nurse bees, because every week or so, I will remove a couple frames because they're going to make a lot of honey in there, and I'll add a couple frames of brood from other colonies, preferably sealed brood or emerging brood. That keeps the numbers up, so that even though that colony is queenless, because you're adding brood, they never seem to want to make a laying worker, and they always keep going. They just keep building queens for you, and the more you do, it seems like the better they get. They will get more aggressive as time passes, because simply being queenless for that long, they don't like it. Okay, so when you're done building your cell builder, you should see as many bees as you see on the top, on the top of the frames in this colony, if not more, because you want it to be packed. So mating nukes. After you have your cells built, you'll need to get those queens mated. I've tried a lot of different things, a lot of different types of mating nukes. And in my area, what works best is at least a 2-frame deep mating nuke. 3 is even better. Sometimes I'll run 4-frame deep mating nukes. But that works better in my area. It gives me a little bit more time. I can leave the queens laying a little bit longer, so I can evaluate their brood patterns better. The small ones, like the real tiny mini mating nukes that only have 3 frames in them, that are only like this big, I've used those here. They work in the early spring, but as the summer passes and the dearths come and go, they get robbed out easily. They lose their efficiency, and that you end up having spent a lot of time and lost a lot of bees not to make as many queens as you thought you were going to. So the 2 and 3 frame deeps or 4 frame deeps work better for me here. I would say farther south, the warmer the climate is, probably the better you could get by with using the little minis. I like these, I think they're made in Finland, these polystyrene nuke boxes. And these are a 6 frame nuke box, and you can get them from Blue Sky Bee Supply in Ohio. But they're a 6 frame nuke box, but they have a divider board. You can slide a divider board in and make them 3 frames on each side. They have an entrance on each side, and they work really well for getting queens mated. They're more expensive, no doubt about that, but they work really well for getting queens mated. And if you pull that divider board out, they work really well for overwintering too. They hold enough heat in there, and they make the bees do much better through the winter. Sugar syrup feeding. It's pretty location dependent. If you're planning to raise a lot of queens in West Virginia or a similar climate, then you will need to feed heavily to get the bees the proper nutrition that they need to raise queens. Hive top feeders work best for me, either like the one pictured on the left or a bucket feeder. I've in the last year or so, I've actually started liking just using gallon Ziploc bags. Fill up a gallon Ziploc bag with half gallon or so of 1-to-1 sugar syrup, lay it right on top of the frames, take a stick pin or something, punch 15 or 20 holes in it, or hit it with a razor blade across the top, and it won't leak out because the surface tension holds the liquid in there, and they'll go right up on top of that, and they'll just suck it down in no time. Naturally, you can't reuse the bags, but they're pretty cheap, and that's a pretty good method. I've actually found that they like taking the sugar syrup down better that way than they do from a hive top feeder. Pollen feeding, I do run pollen feeders here, but I just run a community feeder way out in one of the fields, and it looks just like this. I'm not sure you can even still get these. I've had mine for years. But I put it away from all the other bees, and I keep it filled up, and they use out of it anytime we're having a pollen dearth. So I use that, and I use pollen patties. The difference between dry pollen and pollen patties is dry pollen, they will store in the combs. Pollen patties, they use readily. So as soon as they eat a pollen patty, it's used. It's made into feed, royal jelly, whatever. And the dry pollen, they carry back just like they would pollen from flowers, and they store that in the combs. Overwintering nukes. If you're planning on overwintering nukes for sustainability in a colder climate, I highly recommend the polystyrene 6 frame nukes. You can run them in double deeps or a deep and a half. A lot of different configurations. There's several different types. There's the ones that Blue Sky sell. There's another company, and I think it's called Supreme, if I remember correctly, in Ohio, that actually makes their own. It's a little thicker polystyrene, but it's not as high density. It's close. And then the one on the right is a Lysin, and those are super high density, but they're only an inch thick. But if you peck on them, they sound just like wood. Those work well too. I've tried them all. Other things you'll need if you're queen rearing, queen breeding: queen cages, JZBZ cell cups for grafting, cell bars for grafting, pollen patties, dry pollen sub, lots of sugar, grafting tools, magnifying glasses, bright LED flashlights, because you want something cool, not something that'll roast the larva. Frame holders for grafting. You can buy or make your own queen rearing frames, maybe right way shipper boxes if you're going to be shipping large numbers of queens. The battery boxes, I see a lot of people start out with these, and it scares me because I started out with these too, and I roasted a bunch of queens in shipping. When it gets hot, there's something about that plastic box, and they can't get enough air in them or something. And if you're shipping to southern states, you'll lose a lot of queens that way. I don't use these anymore for that reason. I have boxes of them out here. I'll use them local here on the farm for moving queens around and doing things, but I don't like to ship in them anymore. Recommended books: Queen Rearing Essentials by Mr. Larry Connor. Very good book. He's got a lot of information in there. By the way, you can go back. If you want a copy of this PowerPoint, there's a PDF version of it on my website under lectures at www.newriverhoneybees.com. And you can go download this whole PowerPoint that I've just gone through, and it has these links and everything in it. More recommended books are Increase Essentials, Scientific Queen Rearing written by GM Doolittle. This is the guy that kind of came up with the queen grafting method. Closing thoughts: get a good queen, get good queen mentor, rearing mentor, get good genetics, take classes specific to what you want to learn. Learn from people that are doing what you want to do, and don't give up. It does take some time. Whenever I first started doing artificial insemination, the first year, I didn't do well at all with it. I think I only had 2 queens that survived that year. I got real frustrated, and I gave up on artificial insemination that year, put all my stuff away, started again on it the next year, had better luck. And then from there, you just keep getting better. And that's the same with anything you do. The more you do it, the better you get at it. Now I make, this past year, I think I went through 3 or 4 sets of queen numbers on artificially inseminated queens, and I probably didn't lose 5 out of 400 or 500. There were a lot of them. So that's pretty much the end of the slideshow, the presentation. I'll go ahead and stop my screen share and get back over here to my Zoom window. If you guys give me just a second, and I'll start taking some questions to those that have raised their hands. And the first one I see is Kenny, and I'm going to go ahead and send you a request to ask to unmute, and go ahead and ask us your question.
Hi, Jason. Couple of questions. How long do you wait after setting up your cell builder, Queenless, before you add the grafts? And the second question is, you said you added 8 frames of brood. Mm-hmm. Invariably, some of that might be open brood.
Right.
That would be a right age for them to start raising queens. When you place your grafts in, do you need to go through and make sure they haven't started any queen cells?
Yes. Well, the first thing that I'm going to try to answer your questions together here. The first thing is, whenever I build that queen cell starter, I've already looked to see, make sure there's no queen cells started in there, and I know they're queenless. I will go ahead and put that together like a Saturday morning, and by noon or so, I will put in my first graft. And the reason being is my train of thought on that is they're going to start making queen cells as soon as they realize, if they've got larvae in there that are the right age, they're going to start making queen cells as soon as they realize they're queenless. So if you go ahead and stick a cell bar in there with larvae on it that are turned the right direction and that are the right age, they're going to start drawing those out immediately. Now, I know, because I just built this thing, that any cells that they start is going to be about the same age as the cells that I put in. So whenever I go back to check on those cells to see what they've started, or even if I wait until they're capped, at that point, when I take them out to move them to an incubator, I use an incubator a lot. When I take them out to move them to an incubator, then I'll go through and I'll mash any queen cells that they started down on the frames. A lot of times they won't start a lot down on the frames if you give them a bar at the same time to start with.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Do we have any more hands up? Hello. Okay. Robert Elliott, go ahead. I'm going to ask you to unmute. And what's your question?
You was talking about crushing the cells that you find after you remove your frame. Can't we just cut those cells out and use them also?
You could if you built that colony from a queen that you wanted to produce offspring from. Yeah, you absolutely could. A lot of times I will run what I call brood colonies that basically just make tons and tons of brood, and that's all they're good at. And I'll use those colonies to help stock things that I'm doing, but I'll never want to breed out of them. So I won't use queens that they make. But if it was a good colony and it's genetics that I wanted to keep, yeah, there wouldn't be anything wrong with cutting those out.
Okay.
Is that it? Okay, next would be Dr. Larry. I'm going to ask to unmute. Go ahead and ask me a question.
First of all, thanks a lot for this information. One of the things that I just didn't really understand is you're building that starter colony a little different than I've heard. So can you just re-explain what you're doing there?
Okay, sure. Yeah. Again, I start with a bottom board, and I'll start with a medium super with just foundation in it, nothing else, full of frames with foundation. On top of that, I put a queen excluder. So this is in case a virgin queen comes in, she can't get up to your cells to tear them down. So then on top of that queen excluder, I put a 10 frame deep box, or 8, whatever size I'm using. 8 or 10 both work fine. And in that, I will pull 8 frames of brood from another strong colony. And if that colony doesn't have 8 frames of brood in it, I'll go scavenge through other colonies until I put together 8 frames of brood that is either sealed or emerging or very close to emerging. And I'll put those bees and all into that starter. Now, I've set that starter in the location of a pre-existing strong colony. And this is during the middle of the day or the evening. And then I move that other strong colony away, and I take that queen that was in it, or the queen that would have been in my starter, and I use her to make a split with or something. But the purpose for that is all those field bees that have been flying out all day now will come back to that same entrance where it's now a cell starter, where it used to be a strong colony. So they come back to their cell starter. They've got the empty frames in the medium below this queen excluder, and then they've got all this brood and bees, and a lot of times I'll even shake more bees into it that's in this brood body or brood box on top of the queen excluder, and that's where I'll put my cell frame or my cell bar with queen cells, where I'm going to make my larva and my queen cells, and I'll put that frame right in the middle. And right across the top of that, I'll lay a pollen patty, then I'll set a feeder on top of it and fill it with 1-to-1 sugar syrup. And that usually gets them started pretty good. The first round, you may not get as high a percentage, but by the next round you run through them, it seems like the more rounds you run through them, the more queen cells they want to make. Then once a week, I will pull it up, because they have no queen in their laying to fill those frames back in with brood. Once a week, I'll pull 2 or 3 frames of honey or nectar out, and I'll go to other colonies and pull out more frames of capped brood, or sometimes it'll be a mix of capped brood and open brood, or emerging brood, and I'll put more brood. Once a week, I'm adding more brood back into that colony. So they're constantly keeping built up and staying strong, but they don't have a tendency to want to make a laying worker, I think, because they're still getting that brood smell from where I'm adding those frames once a week.
And the purpose of the field bees in the hive is what?
So they're carrying more nectar and food in. Like if you did that with without putting that colony, that starter colony, in the place of a strong existing colony, you're just, all of your field bees are going to fly out of that colony and go back to their home, and you're going to be left with only nurse bees in that colony. And of course, you're feeding them, which is a good thing. But if you've got the field bees coming in too, they're protecting that colony more from robbers, and they're carrying in more pollen and more nectar.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Next. Do we have any more questions? I don't see any more hands. Let me look at the chat real quick. Okay, so earlier when I was talking about that Excel document, the Ohio State Beekeepers Org queen rearing generator or calculator, Louisa has posted a link for that in the chat. If you want that link, you can go down to the bottom and click on the chat button, and it'll open a window on the side where you can see that link. There's someone asking, do any of the clubs offer grafting training? And I'll let the West Virginia Beekeepers Association answer that in a moment.
Actually, I don't know of any.
Okay. I do sometimes, but it just depends on what kind of year I'm having. This year, I didn't do any trainings on the farm because of the COVID thing, and I'm hoping next year will be better. The amount of pollen patties shown in the cell builder pictures, do you have a small hive beetle issue? Okay, somebody asked about small hive beetles. That's a very good question. I don't have a lot of small hive beetles here. So if you're putting pollen patty on, and I never even thought about this, I'm glad Andy mentioned it. If you're putting pollen patty on your hives and you're in an area that has a lot of small hive beetles, be careful because they're drawn to pollen patties. If I've got a lot of small hive beetles, I would use small strips of pollen patty and add it more frequently. I might only cut like a 2-inch strip and put it in there. That way they're going to eat it up overnight. And then I'll check it the next day and add another piece if I need to, but I'm not going to put a whole big patty on there if I've got a lot of hive beetles. Okay. And David mentioned, yes, Superior Bee out of Ohio. That's the company that actually forms and makes their own polystyrene nukes that they sell in Ohio. And that's pretty much all the questions in the chat. Did Robert have another question? His hand's up, or did we just forget to lower his hand? Robert, did you have another question?
I believe he does.
Okay.
Now on the classes, I know Mark Lilly with the Appalachian Bee Collective gives them every once in a while. He did a couple summers ago.
Yeah, and Mark's very good. He would be a good person to learn from. Any more questions? Are we good to go?
Looks like it.
Can't believe I got through that whole talk in right at an hour.
You did. Fantastic. We thank you so much.
An hour. You're welcome.
We certainly appreciate you spending the time with us this evening, and you all know how to get a hold of him. You want to put your email in the chat box, maybe?
Sure. Let me get
it. And we'll have our next speaker series next month, February 25th. The notice will go out in email like this one did. And it will be Shanda King. She'll be talking about the West Virginia best practices, management practices, and honey labeling. So we hope to see you there.
Hey, everybody have a good evening.
And also this was recorded, so it will be on our WVBA YouTube channel as well.
Okay, and that's, we can just Google for that YouTube channel?
Yes, I was searching for it actually just today, and I was having a hard time finding it. So I'm going to contact my administrator for that and make sure it's searchable.
Okay, great.
Okay, it should be WV Beekeepers Association is what it is. So, all righty then. If there isn't anything else, we're going to go ahead and end for the evening. Thanks again, Jason. Certainly appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right, have a good night.
You too.
Thanks.